Famous pianist told a blind black boy to play piano as a joke. He has an incredible gift. Hey kid, how about playing something for us? I bet you know Happy Birthday. The voice of famous pianist Vincent Sterling echoed through the grand hall of the Lincoln Arts Center, eliciting muffled laughter from the guests of New York's musical elite. David Thompson, only 16, stood motionless beside the Steinway grand piano. His hands clutched his white cane tightly as an awkward silence filled the room. The boy had arrived with his public school music teacher who had managed to get 2 tickets to the most exclusive charity recital of the season. Vincent adjusted his Armani tuxedo and smiled at the audience of patrons and music critics. At 42, he was considered one of the greatest Chopin interpreters of our time, with sold-out world tours and million-dollar contracts. To him, that misplaced boy represented everything that was wrong with the policies of inclusion in cultural events. "Come on, don't be shy," Vincent insisted, his voice dripping with condescension. "I'm sure our generous donors would love to see how we invest in diversity." Ms. Patricia Wells, director of the organizing foundation, muttered something about inappropriate to her assistant, but did not intervene. After all, Vincent Sterling was the star of the evening, responsible for raising millions for the institution. David took a deep breath, his fingers tightening around his cane. He could feel the weight of hundreds of eyes pressing down on him. The air itself seemed hostile, thick with disbelief and hidden mockery. No one there knew that every day, while the other kids played basketball or video games, David locked himself inside the dusty basement of a neighborhood church where an old electric keyboard had been left behind by a choir. No one there knew that for years he had lived in a silence broken only by the vibrations of music, which for him had become a second language, the only language that could explain what he had lost when the accident claimed his parents and his sight. When Vincent sneered and laughed at the idea of the boy daring to mention Bach, the room chuckled with him. But David's calm reply, Partita No. 2 in C minor, carried the gravity of someone who had lived beyond his years. The silence that followed was sharp, and even those accustomed to elite arrogance felt the ground shift slightly beneath them. There was something in the boy's voice, an authority too unusual for a child, that demanded attention. Vincent tried to reassert control. His pride could not handle being challenged, especially not in front of the patrons who funded his comfortable life. He banged the opening bars of the partita in a different key, mocking David's seriousness. But David, standing there with unshaken calm, exposed him. "The piece is in C minor, not D major," he said. The remark cut through the air like glass. People turned, surprised that a blind boy not only recognized the music by ear but called out the deception without hesitation. For the first time that evening, Vincent felt something unfamiliar, unease. He had expected compliance, embarrassment, maybe even tears. What he got instead was confidence so steady that it unsettled him. David, in his blind eyes and quiet words, represented something Vincent had always feared, the kind of talent that cannot be purchased, polished, or manufactured by privilege. David finally stepped toward the piano. He placed his cane gently against the bench, and as his hands hovered over the keys, the restless whispers of the audience stilled. He asked a question that pierced the room. Has anyone here ever lost everything they loved in a single moment and had to rebuild their soul note by note? The words landed heavy. For the first time that night, many realized this boy was not just another forced display of inclusion. He carried with him the raw essence of what art was supposed to be. Vincent tried again to crush him with arrogance. "Enough philosophy," he said sharply. "Play, or leave." But David only nodded, his composure unshaken. "You are right about standards," he answered. "Standards are everything." He then sat at the bench, adjusting with the posture not of a nervous teenager, but of a man ready for battle. Before he began, he did something no one expected. He turned toward the audience and explained what the piece meant. He spoke about Bach, about how the partita was composed after the death of the composer's wife, how each movement represented stages of grief, denial, anger, despair, and finally acceptance. His words were not textbook facts, but revelations delivered with quiet certainty. It was not knowledge from books, it was knowledge from living. Vincent mocked the explanation, but his forced laughter sounded weak. He could sense control slipping away, like sand through clenched fingers. And then David began to play. The first notes floated from the piano not as sound, but as confession. The audience froze. They had just heard Vincent play the same piece with impeccable technical mastery, but the difference was immediate, almost frightening. David's notes did not come from muscle memory. They came from somewhere deeper, from scars invisible to the eye, but audible in every phrase. The guests who moments earlier smirked at the idea of the boy touching the piano now leaned forward, drawn to something they could not name. The wealthy banker's daughter who had whispered about teaching manners now felt her throat tighten. Tears welled up before she could stop them. Patricia Wells, who had dismissed the boy as a minor inconvenience, realized she was witnessing something that money could never buy. Vincent stood beside the piano, his smile long gone. Each note David played chipped away at the foundation of his arrogance. He saw his years of technical training, his expensive education, his countless rehearsals, all suddenly meaningless when compared to the raw truth of a blind boy channeling grief into art. David did not just play, he transported them. With each movement of the partita, he pulled the room into his own story. The night of the accident, the sterile smell of the hospital, the suffocating silence of blindness, the long hours alone with only music to remind him that life still had something worth holding on to. His fingers moved effortlessly, but what stunned the audience was not speed or accuracy. It was how the music seemed to breathe. Dr. Harrison Webb, seated in the third row, leaned forward, whispering almost to himself, "My God, this is not interpretation. This is truth." By the second movement, the room was no longer full of patrons flaunting diamonds and privilege. It was full of human beings stripped bare by sound. The arrogance that had filled the hall evaporated, replaced by a collective vulnerability they did not know they carried. Margaret Rothschild, who had mocked him minutes earlier, now sobbed openly. Her jeweled hands trembled as she clutched her companion's arm. She was not just hearing music. She was hearing her own hidden grief, her own buried losses, voiced by the hands of a boy society had dismissed. Vincent's heart pounded in his chest. For years he had been praised, celebrated, adored. Yet never once had he moved a room like this. He felt something shatter inside him, a recognition that he, with all his fame, had always been empty compared to this child. His technique had been flawless but sterile. David's was transcendent. By the third movement, people no longer whispered. They held their breath. Even the ticking of the old clock in the hall seemed to hush itself, unwilling to intrude. David's hands glided across the keys, his face serene, as if channeling something greater than himself. He was not performing. He was surrendering, letting Bach's morning intertwine with his own until the hall itself felt like a cathedral. When the final notes faded, silence filled the room. It was not the silence of discomfort, but of reverence. No one dared to move. Then, as if pulled by some unseen force, the entire audience rose to its feet. The applause was thunderous, but it carried more than admiration. It carried apology. It carried awe. It carried the recognition that they had witnessed not just talent, but greatness. Vincent stood frozen, his world collapsing. His humiliation was absolute, and worse, it was deserved. He had tried to turn a boy into a spectacle, but instead the boy had revealed him as hollow. Dr. Webb approached David immediately, his voice full of reverence. "Young man, we must talk about your future." Margaret Rothschild whispered through tears that she would fund his education. Reporters scribbled notes. Critics exchanged astonished glances. The night that was supposed to affirm Vincent Sterling's supremacy had instead crowned a new star. 6 months later, David walked the halls of Juilliard on a full scholarship, the youngest ever admitted. The church basement where he once practiced was replaced with world-class studios. But David never forgot what brought him there. He practiced with the same hunger, carrying with him the memory of that humiliating night turned triumph. Meanwhile, Vincent's career collapsed. Videos of the incident spread across the internet, his arrogance dissected by millions. Contracts dissolved, critics turned cold, and his once loyal patrons withdrew their support. He attempted tours in Europe, but the shadow of that night followed him. Audiences did not want perfection without soul. They wanted what David had given them, truth. David flourished, performing in sold-out halls, inspiring young musicians from forgotten neighborhoods. He created foundations to support blind and disadvantaged youth in the arts. Every time he sat at a piano, he carried with him the memory of his parents, of the church basement, and of the cruel laugh that had given him his first great audience. When asked if he hated Vincent Sterling, David only smiled. "He gave me the greatest gift," he said. "He gave me a stage." Years later, at Carnegie Hall, David performed again, this time as the star of the evening. His music filled the legendary hall, and among the thousands of attendees sat Margaret Rothschild, Patricia Wells, and dozens of critics who once doubted him. Vincent Sterling, alone in a dim apartment in Queens, watched on television. The ovation lasted 15 minutes, echoing across the world. And in that moment, it became clear. Privilege may open doors, but only truth can move hearts. David had proven that real music, like real greatness, is born not of arrogance, but of suffering transformed into light. His story became legend, told in conservatories, classrooms, and concert halls around the world. A story not just of a blind boy who conquered the piano, but of how prejudice crumbles in the face of undeniable brilliance. Because in the end, David Thompson did not just play box notes. He played the tears, the loss, the healing, and the hope that belongs to every soul who has ever suffered and survived. And that is something no amount of money, privilege, or fame could ever imitate.